Hi, this is Charlie. Let's take just a moment to think about the role that the core object plays in our game. The core object is defined in its own class called core, and we keep core in the same folder in our JavaScript folder, the main folder where we do most of our work, okay, right here. And the core object implements a singleton pattern. And in order to see clearly what we're doing, I'm going to take the very simple code, really, that is inside of here out of the core object for just a second. And let's look at the singleton pattern by itself. So we declare a variable called underbar instance, all right? And we check if that variable instance is equal to null, in which case we set it to this. And then because this is a constructor, there's a kind of implied return underscore return this at the very bottom of the code. That's sort of the way constructors work. They return an instance of themselves, of the object which they represent, which in this case is themselves. And but we don't need to write that because it's done for us, it's handled for us. So instead, we simply set instance equal to this, which then is being returned by the object. And or if instance not equal to null, we just return the instance, which makes sure that the instance itself only is being created one time. Now let's paste in the rest of our code here. And what we check in the constructor is we say if an instance is null, if it's new, then the first time we define a set of properties. Now here's a simple property. Forgive me for being a little verbose here. These properties don't need to be this complicated, but I like using define properties sometimes because it gives us a little more control. There's a set of variables that we want the core class to always have access to. And in effect, these are globals in our program, but we are not allowing them to be accessed by all the parts of our program, only the parts of the program that needs access to these. These include our camera, our renderer, our scene. They include the grid NPC, the grid maze, and the grid for the fog, okay? And we define a property here, and this is one of the few times when we'll let ourselves use this, but we do let ourselves use this in this one case, since this is going to be valid inside the constructor, okay? It's one of the few places in our program where it's safe to use this in a JavaScript code. And we're going to set the value of this property box size to 30, and we're going to say it's not enumerable, it's not configurable, it's not writable. Then here we're going to create the camera, and we're going to use a backing store for it. In other words, we're going to use one of these variables up here, and we'll say that it is enumerable, it's configurable. Frankly, I just want to show you how to do this more importantly than what settings we're actually giving it at this time. Here's our fog, here's the maze, etc. And I'm using a convention here, which perhaps not everyone would agree with. I'm making my properties that I'm using defining this way so that they're public. I'm making them with a capital B and a capital C. A lot of people might disagree with that because it's usually the symbol for saying that's the constructor, the one you need to call new on. But I'm just trying to distinguish it from our backing stores. And perhaps an underscore would have been a better way to do it. But let's not fight that battle right now, okay? And this guy's gotten a little out of place. That's where he belongs. So that's our core class. And then let's go over to a relatively simple class like buildings. And here we use core. We declare a small core instance. So we're using require here. And we require core. We get an instance of the class. Now we're going to need to call new on it. So we define core this way. And then in our constructor, we say the small c core, which is going to be scoped globally to this object. So an object in here which has global scope will be instanced to a new core. Now we'll do the same thing, say in particles. We do core, core, core again. And in our constructor, we create it. And you would think, of course, that you wouldn't be able to share global variables very effectively that way because you're going to keep creating new instances of the object. But this doesn't create a new instance. Remember, we implemented the singleton pattern. So it always ends up being the same instance. This always ends up being the same. Not that it would particularly matter since these variables are declared globally, which means they're static variables. But let's not worry about that right now. The point is they're all the same. And then most importantly, over here, they're the same. Okay, so we've got core, and here is where we can, so we, inside of control, we create it, and then we set up our camera. We set core.camera equals this, core.scene equals this, core, well, that's not the same fog that we're working with. But here when we need box size, so every time we're referring to one of our major variables, we pass it in as core itself. And in this particular case, we didn't want to use in pointer lock setup. We didn't want to use core. We didn't want to put it on the top like this. So we just pass it in as a variable to the method that we wanted to use in pointer lock setup. We simply pass in core and then use it that way because that was just the way I decided to do that. It seemed simpler. Only this one method needed access to core, so we did it that way. Okay. And then with all of this running, okay, then we're able to, inside of our program, well, let's start the program again to prove that we haven't, to ourselves, that we haven't broken anything, and we haven't. And then inside of our program, everything works, right? We have access to the grids, to everything, all these different guys. And then the one point of it that I'm not showing to you, which I probably ought to, is in control. We have a method called show NPC position. And in here, we pass the core grid maze and the core grid NPC. We put them into grid NPC and grid maze here. And then we emit the, over the sockets here that we're using, the entire positions object. We incent everything, okay? The entire positions object, including the grid maze and the grid NPC. And that means that over in our listener, over here in the listener, okay, we can, we're being sent the entire grid and the entire NPC, and we have another core object set up in the listener, and then we can set it equals its grid NPC equal to the message that came over on the socket, right? Because we started a socket here, and now we can listen over here on our listener. And the end effect is that we can have, as we move around in this world, we can see the grid being painted over here in the listener so that we can see them both at the same time. Okay, that's all I wanted to show you here, sort of late at night, but I wanted to make sure you understood how to use those objects. Thanks so much for listening, and have a good day now. Bye.